Welcome to our study of the book of Daniel. This is a work of the Mediview Church of Christ in Mesquite, Texas. And now, here is Mike Heisel with today's lesson.
Now let us have a little talk with Jesus.
Thank you for tuning in to our Bible study today. I'm excited because today we're beginning a study of the book of Daniel. And Daniel is most definitely a book that is needed in our time. Daniel is a book, the main message of which is that even though it may seem like evil is prevailing, God is in control, and in the end, God will give victory to His people. And so, I can't think of a more timely book than the book of Daniel, even though it's a very ancient book. Our English Old Testaments are divided into 4 sections. Now, Jewish Old Testaments, Hebrew Old Testaments, are divided into 3 sections. You see that tradition going back at least to the time of Jesus, Luke 24:44. But our Old Testaments are divided into 4 sections. The first section is the section of law, that is Genesis through Deuteronomy, 5 books. The second section is the section of history, that is 12 books, Joshua through Esther. The third section is the section of poetry, that is Job through Song of Solomon. And the fourth section is made up of 17 books, and it's the section of prophecy, that is Isaiah through Malachi. And this fourth section, the section of prophecy, is divided into 2 sections. The first section is the major prophets, and the second section is the minor prophets. The major prophets are the books of Isaiah through Daniel. The minor prophets are the books of Hosea through Malachi. And so the book that we're studying, Daniel, is the final book of the section of the major prophets in that 4th division in our English Old Testaments. Now, by the way, the major prophets are major and the minor prophets are minor, not because major prophets are more important than minor prophets, but it's just a designation that is given to them because of the size of the books. And even though Lamentations is not a very large book, it's included among the major prophets because it was written by Jeremiah, so it's included there with Jeremiah. So the book of Daniel, chronologically, would be roughly contemporary with Jeremiah and with Ezekiel and with Habakkuk, at least in the beginning. And the end of the book of Jeremiah would be more a contemporary with Haggai and with Zechariah. You see, the prophet Jeremiah, during the time that Daniel, and we'll talk more about this in a minute, was carried away into Babylonian captivity, Jeremiah was a prophet who remained in Israel. He remained among the Jews. Ezekiel was carried away into Babylonian captivity, but Ezekiel was a prophet to his own people who were in captivity. He was a prophet to the Jews who were in captivity. Whereas Daniel, carried away into Babylonian captivity, didn't prophesy primarily to the Jews. He prophesied in the Babylonian court and later in the Persian court. And so he was more a prophet to the pagans. But Daniel would be roughly a contemporary in his early years with Jeremiah and with Ezekiel and with Habakkuk, and then in his later years with Haggai and with Zechariah. Of course, those books would fall about a decade after the close of the book of Daniel. But let's talk now about the author of the book of Daniel. Who wrote the book of Daniel? Well, here you see a big split between conservative scholars and liberal scholars. Conservative scholars say, well, Daniel wrote the book of Daniel. Liberal scholars won't accept that. And the primary reason why liberal scholars won't accept that is because they don't believe in predictive prophecy. And the book of Daniel, especially in chapter 11, is really, really detailed in its prophecies concerning the wrangling between the Seleucid Empire to the north and the Ptolemaic Empire to the south, so Syria and Egypt, and they're wrestling over Palestine, and then later the persecution of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who was a king of the Seleucid kingdom. He was a king of Syria, and his persecutions of the Jews in Palestine. And so Daniel's prophecy of that in Daniel 11 is so detailed. Liberal scholars say, well, there's no way that the 6th century prophet Daniel could have foreseen that, and so he couldn't have written it. And so they would say that there was some unknown 2nd century prophet who wrote the book of Daniel. Well, you know, as conservative people, we believe the Bible. We believe that, you know, though there may have been over 40 human penmen who actually put, you know, pen to paper and wrote the scriptures, we believe that God the Holy Spirit was inspiring every one of them, and God knows the end from the beginning. God has no problem with foretelling the future, and so we believe in predictive prophecy, so we think that Daniel wrote it. And there's good reason to think that Daniel wrote this book. The book of Daniel is written in the 3rd person in chapters 1 to 6, but chapters 7 through 12 is written in the 2nd person. And Daniel, who's writing in the 2nd person, you know, clearly seems to be the author of the book. Consider, for instance, what Daniel is told in Daniel 12 and verse 4. But you, Daniel, roll up and seal the words of the scroll until the time of the end. Many will go here and there to increase knowledge. So here, the one who actually put the words on the scroll, Daniel, is told to seal up the book. And this is the latest dated prophecy in the book, dating to about 537 BC. So it seems like the book of Daniel itself would make the claim that Daniel was the author of it. But even more importantly than that, as Christian people, we believe that Jesus is supreme, and Jesus argued that Daniel was the author of the book. Consider, for instance, Matthew 24 and verse 15, what's known as the Olivet Discourse. Jesus is foretelling first the destruction of Jerusalem. And he says in Matthew 24:15, so when you see standing in the holy place the, quote, abomination that causes desolation. And there he's quoting from the book of Daniel. There are 3 potential passages that may be quoted from the book of Daniel. Daniel 9, Daniel 11, Daniel 12. But at any rate, Daniel's writing, so Jesus quotes Daniel, the abomination of desolation, and Jesus goes on to say, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. So here, Jesus believed that Daniel not only spoke of the abomination of desolation, but he wrote of the abomination of desolation. Jesus would not be talking about the one who would read the Olivet Discourse. It seems like Jesus is talking about the one who would read Daniel's scroll. So Jesus believed that Daniel didn't just speak those words, but Daniel also wrote those words. And so, you know, for me, that's enough. Daniel, the 6th century prophet, is the one who wrote the book. Now, let's consider a little bit of the background as to why Daniel was in this particular situation. In 2 Kings chapter 20, we're told about one of the best kings of Judah by the name of Hezekiah. And Hezekiah had been sick and was going to die, but because he prayed to the Lord for his mercy, God granted him 15 more years and gave him a miraculous sign that he would have 15 more years. If you remember, the shadow went backwards on the sundial. And so that was a sign that Hezekiah was given more life. Well, in response to that miracle, emissaries were sent from Babylon to Hezekiah in Jerusalem. Now, undoubtedly what these Babylonian emissaries were wanting was for Hezekiah to be their ally against Assyria. Assyria was the world power at this time. And Assyria had given Babylon major problems and had given Israel and Judah major problems. And so when these emissaries came from Babylon to Hezekiah, Hezekiah in his pride wanted to show what a good ally he would be. And so he showed them all of his treasures, the treasures in his own house and in the temple. And as a result of Hezekiah's pride, here's what the prophet Isaiah said to Hezekiah. 2 Kings chapter 20, verse 16. Then Isaiah said to Hezekiah, "Hear the word of the Lord. The time will surely come when everything in your palace and all that your predecessors have stored up until this day will be carried off to Babylon. Nothing will be left, says the Lord. And some of your descendants, your own flesh and blood, who will be born to you, will be taken away, and they will become eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon." Now, that prophecy that Isaiah gave Hezekiah is fulfilled in the book of Daniel. When we open the book of Daniel, here's what we read. Daniel 1, beginning in verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia, and put in the treasure house of his God. Verse 3. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, king of his court officials, to bring into the king's service, that is, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily account of food and wine from the king's table. They were trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Verse 6. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah, Daniel. And so you see what Isaiah foretold, that some of Hezekiah's descendants would be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. That's fulfilled through what befell Daniel. Now, just give a little bit more background. So God made covenant with Israel at Mount Sinai. And God told Israel, "If you will obey me, I will bless you. But if you disobey me, I will curse you." And you find this several passages. Consider, for instance, Deuteronomy 28. You see this clearly, Deuteronomy 28. God said, "Listen, if you disobey me, I will curse you. I will curse you in the land, and I will send against you a foreign nation who will take you captive and will carry you into a land where they speak a strange language, and there you will be." Well, the book of Jeremiah and the book of Ezekiel and the book of Daniel record the fulfillment of God carrying out that curse. You read through the historical books, you read in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles about how bad Israel got. Now you remember, after the death of Solomon, when his son Rehoboam began to reign, the united kingdom of Israel split. And so the southern tribes, that is Judah and Benjamin, kept a descendant of David over them, right? Rehoboam began to reign and reigned, a descendant of David reigned all the way through till the time of Zedekiah. The northern kingdom, however, chose Jeroboam to be its king, and they went through multiple dynasties. Not just one dynasty as in the south, they went through multiple dynasties. And so the northern kingdom lasted from the time that it split in 930 BC until it was carried away into Assyrian captivity in 722 BC. Okay, but the southern kingdom lasted for a longer period of time. But then God raised up the Babylonians, and the Babylonians came and carried Judah into captivity in 3 deportations. Now the first deportation is only explicitly described here in the book of Daniel. That would have been in 605 BC, And that's when Daniel and Daniel's friends and some others were carried away into captivity, as well as some of the articles of the temple. So that's 605 BC. The second deportation was the carrying away of King Jehoiakim, as well as some of the really skilled people of the land. That would have been in 597 BC. That's when Ezekiel was carried away into captivity. And then the third and final deportation happened in 586 BC. So nearly 20 years separated the first deportation when Daniel was taken to Babylon from the final one. But in 586 BC, the city of Jerusalem was captured. It was destroyed. The temple was burned down. The king, Zedekiah, had all of his sons killed before his eyes, and his own eyes were put out, and then he was carried away as a captive to Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar put Gedaliah as a governor to rule over the land. And so Judah was totally subjugated to the Babylonians. But at any rate, that's what we see being fulfilled here in the book of Daniel. Daniel was carried away as a result of God fulfilling the curse that he foretold through Moses way back in Deuteronomy chapter 28. Now, the events of the book of Daniel, they stretch over a long period of time. So Daniel is carried away into captivity 605 BC, right? Chapter 1. But then the last vision of the book happens. It's recorded in Daniel chapters 10 through 12, and it's dated, according to Daniel chapter 10 and verse 1, to the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia. Now, that would be 537 BC. And so Daniel, he was a young man when he was carried away into captivity, maybe a young teenager, maybe about 15 in Daniel chapter 1. But by the time we get to Daniel chapter 10, Babylon has fallen to the Persians in 539, and now Daniel is an old man. Daniel would be in his 80s by that particular point in time. So the events of the book of Daniel stretch over a long period of time. So when was Daniel written then? Well, again, there's this division between conservative scholars and liberal scholars. Liberal scholars, again, because they don't believe in predictive prophecy, they would date the writing of the book to between 168 and 164 BC. And we won't go into more of the reasons why they would say it couldn't have been written after 164. We'll talk about that when we get there, when we get to chapter 11. But that's what liberal scholars say. Of course, we believe Jesus and we believe the book of Daniel. And so that being the case, it would seem like the book of Daniel was written shortly after the last dated prophecy of the book. So, again, Daniel chapter 12 verse 4 happened in about 537 BC, and Daniel is told then to roll up and seal the words of the scroll until the time of the end. So the book of Daniel was written 537, 530 BC, somewhere in that time frame. Now, one other interesting thing about the book, the New Testament was written in Greek. The Old Testament was written in Hebrew, with just a few exceptions. There are a few passages in the Old Testament written in Aramaic. You've got a section in the book of Ezekiel, you've got a verse in the book of Jeremiah, and you have a section of the book of Daniel that's written in Aramaic. From Daniel chapter 2 verse 4 through Daniel chapter 7 verse 28, Daniel is not written in Hebrew, it's written in Aramaic. Now, the book begins with Hebrew, chapter 1 verse 1 through chapter 2 verse 3. The book ends with Hebrew, chapters 8 through 12. But in the middle, there's this large section that's written in Aramaic. So, when you think about an outline of the book of Daniel, Daniel really easily divides into two sections, chapters 1 to 6 and chapters 7 through 12. Chapters 1 through 6 record events that happened to Daniel and to Daniel's friends in the court of Babylon and later Persia. Chapters 7 through 12 record 4 visions that Daniel saw. Now, it really is interesting to look at some of the parallels that you have here. You know, for instance, you've got the introduction of chapter 1 that just kind of sets the stage for all the drama that follows. But you do see some interesting parallels in the book. For instance, Daniel chapter 2 records that Nebuchadnezzar had a vision concerning 4 world empires. Well, Daniel chapter 7 records Daniel's vision of these same 4 world empires. So you get this parallel between chapter 2 and chapter 7. Daniel 3 records God's miraculous deliverance of Daniel's friends from the fiery furnace, right? Because they won't succumb to paganism. Daniel 6 records Daniel's miraculous deliverance by God from the plots of the pagans. You remember now Persia's in power, and because of jealousy over Daniel, they persuade the king to make a terrible law, and Daniel ends up being thrown in the lion's den, but God won't allow the lions to eat Daniel. So chapter 3 and chapter 6, Daniel and his friends are miraculously delivered. Chapter 4 records God's judgment on Nebuchadnezzar, because Nebuchadnezzar in his pride won't see that he's only been able to build Babylon because of God's providential protection. God strikes Nebuchadnezzar with insanity, right? So it's a judgment on a pagan king. Chapter 5 is God's judgment on the last pagan king of Babylon, Belshazzar. Brings out the articles of the temple that Nebuchadnezzar took away from Jerusalem and put in the temple of his false gods. And so Belshazzar irreverently pulls those articles out and is feasting with others out of those articles. And you remember the fingers of a man's hand appear and write a message of judgment against Belshazzar. And that very night, through the Medes and the Persians, God brings judgment on Belshazzar. So chapter 4 and chapter 5 are God's judgment on Babylonian kings. Chapter 4, a judgment on the first Babylonian king. Chapter 5, a judgment on the last Babylonian king. So you see that interesting parallel. Chapters 2 and chapter 7, 4 world empires. Chapters 3 and chapter 6, God's miraculous deliverance of Daniel and the 3 friends. Chapter 4 and chapter 5, God's judgment on the first and on the last king of Babylon. So you know, there are some really interesting things about its structure. But you know, let me say something about the second section of the book and the arrangement. So chapter 7, you know, there are 4 visions there. Chapter 7 is one vision, chapter 8 is a second vision, chapter 9 is a third vision, and then chapters 10 through 12 is a fourth vision. So chapter 7 is of the 4 world empires, right? Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. Chapter 8 focuses in on the middle 2. It focuses in on Persia and on Greece. And chapter 9 ultimately will tell of God's deliverance of the Jews from captivity when the Persians take power. And I do believe that it looks on forward to God's judgment on Rome. And I think that it foretells the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in AD 70, and then ultimately God's judgment on Rome. And then chapters 10 through 12, the focus really is on that third kingdom. That is, the kingdoms that came from Alexander the Great, the Grecian kingdoms, and what they ultimately would do to the Jewish people. But it looks forward ultimately to God's final deliverance of His people in resurrection. So, you know, there is so much more to be said about the book of Daniel, but the main message that we get from the book of Daniel is that God is sovereign. God rules. You know, for instance, Daniel 4:25. Nebuchadnezzar's insanity was intended to teach him this point. Daniel 4, Verse 25, you will be driven away from people, and you will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like an ox and be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all the kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes. That's the message of the book of Daniel. God is in control. And it may look like evil is winning, but rest assured, God will win the victory, and God will give victory to his people. So I look forward to the coming weeks when we can study through the book of Daniel. God bless you.
We thank you for taking the time to study the Bible with us. We pray that this has been an edifying experience and that you would join us again. If at any point during the Bible study you had some questions, please feel free to email us at mheisel@meadowview.org. The email is both on the screen and in the description. It is our goal to answer every Bible question with a Bible answer, to speak where the Bible speaks, and to be silent where it is silent. God bless you. We love you.